Okay, welcome to part 3 of Floodplain 101 for Realtors. My name is John Hayes. I am the Floodplain Coordinator for Santa Cruz County, and I will be providing this presentation to you today. The purpose of this presentation is to help strengthen your ability to provide the best customer service to your clients and assist local communities and residents with identifying and reducing flood risks. Today, we'll be covering the basics of flood insurance. Specifically, where is it required, how does it work, and what is covered. Land near the water, even the waterways in the deserts, has always and will always be a popular place to live by, but this brings risk. In a high-risk flood zone, there is a 1 in 4 chance of flooding during a 30-year mortgage. Flood insurance is an important form of economic protection against flooding and flood-related damages, not only for the homeowner, but for the community around it. Federal flood insurance is available in communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Buildings are covered up to $250,000 for residential structures, up to $500,000 for commercial structures. It insures the building and its foundation, electrical and plumbing systems, central air, furnaces and water heaters, refrigerators, stoves, dishwashers, permanently installed carpet over unfurnished flooring. It can also include contents up to $100,000 for a residential structure and $500,000 for a commercial structure. This includes things like clothing, furniture, electronic equipment, portable appliances like air conditioners or microwaves or dishwashers, carpeting that's not included in the building coverage, washers, dryers, etc. When looking at generating the information for high-risk flood zones, what the insurance agents are going to look at are things such as the lowest premiums are going to occur where the structures are constructed so that the lowest floor is an area above the base flood elevation by at least 1 foot, if not more. You will see higher premiums if the structure is built at or below the base flood elevation, especially the lower you go. The lower you go, the more quickly the premiums are going to increase. Also, if there are crawl spaces or other enclosures below the floor that are below the base flood elevation that don't have adequate openings or don't meet the regulatory requirements. So this is looking at a set of premiums based on some hypothesized homes in an area, and you can see that if the home was 4 feet below the base flood elevation, somebody could be paying at this time as much as $9,500 a year for flood insurance. If it was elevated to the base flood elevation, they'd be paying somewhere around $1,400 or more a year, and if the floor was 3 feet above, they'd pay as little as $430 a year. Please keep in mind, these numbers change yearly. If the building has a crawl space, which is fairly common in older buildings in Santa Cruz County, not so common in newer buildings, they have to have proper openings or vents based on the total area of enclosure. The rule of thumb is you need at least 1.5 inches of opening for every square foot of enclosure. The utilities must be elevated above the base flood elevation. In Arizona, again, it's 1 foot above. And the area can only be used for parking, storage, building access, or some combination of the three. So, for example, a attached garage has to have these openings in it if it's not properly elevated, according to the state of Arizona. Some recent trends in flood insurance is that subsidized insurance rates are being increased incrementally until actual cost of the insurance is being paid by the policyholder. This is called actuarial cost. Rates are going up on the order of 18% to 20% a year above what they were until this is reached. This is due to some changes in flood insurance regulations that were passed back in 2012 and 2014. Policyholders are paying a surcharge now to supplement the cost of running the National Flood Insurance Program. This is based on the type of home they have. If it's a primary structure, they're paying like a $50 surcharge. If it's not a primary residence, they're paying a $250 surcharge. Lenders and insurance agents are being much more cautious and requiring elevation certificates. Again, this is related to the changes in the regulations that happened back in 2012 and 2014. Private flood insurance policies are also being considered. In part, you see this especially with more expensive homes or commercial industrial structures, because the limits of the National Flood Insurance Program do not cover the full cost of those buildings, and the banks want to make sure that those investments are actually covered. We also are seeing supplemental policies now being offered. So to look at the history of flood insurance in our local community, in the city of Nogales, the last time we checked, which was about a year ago, there were 213 policies in force, which had about $49,610,000 worth of insurance coverage in place. There had been 65 paid losses over the history of the National Flood Insurance Program in Nogales, with a total of about $687,318.25 in paid losses, and one substantial damage claim since 1978. In the unincorporated Santa Cruz County, we have 311 policies in force, representing almost $81 million of insurance, with 54 paid losses for a total of almost $737,000 in paid losses, with 4 of those being substantial damage claims since 1978. A substantial damage is where the damage to the structure equaled or exceeded 50% of the value of the structure before the damaging event occurred. So some important points about flood insurance. Flood insurance is recommended in all flood zone types, but it's only required in specific zones. However, lenders can require flood insurance and/or elevation information from anyone regardless of the flood zone designation. We kind of refer to this as the golden rule. They have the gold. If you want their gold, you have to obey their rule. Flood insurance policies have a 30-day waiting period before they go into effect. This was implemented years ago to prevent people from getting flood insurance just before a flood hit and then dropping the flood insurance right after the flood. So they didn't really have to pay into the insurance. Policies with subsidized rates can trigger or can be transferred to a new property owner as long as there's no lapse in coverage. They just have to go to the insurance agent to do that transfer. So your client might ask you a question such as, what will my flood insurance premium be for a home? One, I would research if the current owner has a flood insurance policy and what type, because that would tell you how much their coverage is, as well as being able to transfer that policy. Encourage or suggest the clients talk to an insurance agent as early as possible about flood insurance. And based on our experience, the insurance that is paid for through a lender is going to be much more expensive than the insurance through an agent, on the order of up to 10 times more expensive. So an insurance agent is critical for answering this question. Is there anything I can do to lower my insurance premiums? Well, this depends on the nature of the structure itself. We can reduce the risk by filling in enclosures or bringing them up to standard, moving the machinery or electric panels for the house above the floodplain. For example, we had a warehouse that was built in Rio Rico a few years back, and the air conditioning units were put on the ground. They were required to be elevated approximately 3 feet above the ground, but they were put on the ground. Because of that, when the elevation certificate was submitted to the insurance company, the premiums for that warehouse shot through the roof. And they literally saved several $1,000s a year when they went back in and elevated all of those air conditioning units so that they were properly 3 feet above the ground. So making little changes like that can have an impact on insurance premiums. The other thing you can do is check with the community to ensure that the information used for the insurance is the most up-to-date information available, or if the maps have changed. We do not recommend the use of the clearinghouses. A lot of banks will use them, but we don't recommend using them for one simple reason. Santa Cruz County Flood Control District is the official repository for the information for the unincorporated Santa Cruz County. We are the ones that are to make the official determination on whether a structure is in the floodplain or not. We have the official maps. We have all that official information. A lot of times the clearinghouses are using a database, and those databases don't look at the maps. They don't check where the property is. They don't check where the structure is. It's yes or no. And many a time we find people being charged for flood insurance when they are nowhere near a floodplain because a clearinghouse made a mistake. Also, you can encourage your community to join the community rating system program, or encourage them to do activities that earn a better rating if they are already a member. The Community Rating System program is a program put forth by the federal government that grades a community on what it's doing above and beyond the federally required minimums for floodplain management. Unincorporated Santa Cruz County is currently a Class 8 community. This means that we have higher standards and higher regulations that give us some benefit to reducing damages in the area. Because of this, we get a automatic 10% discount for flood insurance premiums in unincorporated Santa Cruz County. The city of Nogales is not a member of this program. They have to apply by themselves to become a member of that program. Floodplain regulations. Why do they exist? What is or is not allowed, and how do I find them? The floodplain regulations are an agreement. They're an agreement between the federal government and local communities. The federal government is agreeing to make subsidized flood insurance available to the community, though again, the laws passed in 2012 and 2014 are changing that. And the community is agreeing to adopt and enforce regulations that at a minimum meet the federal requirements. To kind of give you just a brief overview of the history again, 1968 was the National Flood Insurance Program established. 71, Governor Castro signed Executive Order 77-6 for floodplain management, documenting the intent by the state of Arizona to comply with the provisions of the National Flood Insurance Program. 1976, the minimum standards were adopted and established under the 44th Code of Federal Regulations in Part 60.3. In 1978, the Arizona Revised Statute, Section 48-30601 to 3612 were passed and adopted, creating flood control districts in every county. In 2001, the most current floodplain and erosion hazard management ordinance for Santa Cruz County was adopted, and there is an update pending. What they require is a permit for development in high-risk areas or local regulatory floodplains. The requirements for new subdivisions are also described within the ordinance, and the permitting process, the conditions that are generally required, details of when a permit may not be required or may be denied, as well as the process for appeals, variances, and violations. Our local regulations must meet or exceed federal and state required minimums. Changes must be reviewed and approved by both FEMA and the state of Arizona to ensure the minimum requirements are met. They have to go through the local notice and adoption process. They have to be notified. There has to be a hearing. There has to be so much public input process allowed, etc. We are encouraged by both the state and FEMA to be more restrictive than the state and federal minimum standards, as doing so can result in lower insurance premiums and create safer communities. This is one of the few times where the federal government says they are the minimum you will meet, not the maximum you shall meet. They contain administrative and enforcement procedures, as well as reference the flood insurance rate maps. Just to kind of look at it in brief, in terms of what some of the differences are because of what the state of Arizona did. We have a minimum freeboard where you have to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation. This is not required by the federal government. We have the same surcharge requirement that you can only increase the depth of flooding through development by 1 foot, creating a floodway. Habitable structures, the federal government allows habitable structures in the floodway with a lot of engineering to show that it's a safe structure. Santa Cruz County has said, you know what, no, we're just not going to do that at all. Mobile homes have to be elevated 3 feet above grade, regardless of depth in the federal standard. The Arizona standard requires the bottom of the structural frame to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation, regardless of how deep that base flood elevation may be. And then septic systems are allowed under both systems, but in Arizona they're required to be set back from the channel based on what is called the erosion hazard. So how does Santa Cruz County differ? Major differences are as follows. We don't allow any improvements in the floodway at all, period. It's not going to be entertained. We require the elevation of structures in certain situations, like box canyons, to be 1.5 feet instead of 1 feet above the base flood elevation. When floodproofing is done, we require that floodproofing to be done 1.5 feet above the base flood elevation instead of the 1 foot that the state of Arizona requires. With the flood openings, we require them to be 1.5 square inches per square foot instead of 1 square inch per square foot. And this is in part due to the fact that floodwaters are not necessarily clean here. They're carrying debris, and that debris can clog up openings. So this is a factor to account for that. We also have the 50% rule, which is cumulative for 10 years if the structure remains in its original footprint, or for life of the structure if the structure expands beyond its original footprint. What this basically means is that if you're within the 10-year window, if you're remaining within the footprint, or outside of that, just whatever the amount of time is necessary, if you've expanded the building beyond its original footprint, as soon as you hit 50% of the value of the structure in improvements or repairs that are required to have a permit, then the building must be brought into conformance, meaning it has to be properly elevated. Some other differences is we regulate an erosion hazard setback to prevent structural and septic systems from being placed in areas where they could be exposed or destroyed by channel migration. We regulate riparian habitat to a degree, requiring habitat disturbances to be as little as possible and replanted when disturbed. We have a retention-detention requirement for new developments so that runoff from those new developments does not increase the runoff downstream and increase the amount of flooding that we'll see in the future. We also regulate local regulatory floodplains down to a discharge of 50 cubic feet of water per second during the 1% storm event. Again, this was going back to the fact that the county ended up spending significant amounts of public funds to deal with minor flooding issues in terms of the volume of water, and we didn't have any regulatory authority on that. So we had developed under the ordinance regulatory authority so that we can minimize the need to expend those public funds in the future. Why be stricter than the state? Flooding has caused a lot of damage in Arizona. At one point, Arizona was in the top 10 in national damage claims, and that was pre-KATRINA. It protects property rights. Developing the floodplain can have its own rewards: bigger trees, closer to wildlife, access to natural areas or waterways, but it also comes with a higher personal responsibility due to the risks involved. When everyone builds with the flood risks in mind, everyone is better protected from flooding and flood-related damages. It also helps us reduce the flood insurance premiums. It makes the community more resilient to flooding, so we have a shorter recovery time after a flood event and have to spend less money to clean up and recover. In terms of the permitting process, the permitting is controlled by the Santa Cruz County Floodplain and Erosion Hazard Management Ordinance number 2001-03. You can find that online on the county website. Any and all development, which is a man-made activity, in a high-risk zone must go through the permitting process. It's required by state, federal, and local regulations, and the permits must be approved before the floodplain application and permit process can be considered complete. For unincorporated county in the city of Nogales, permitting is done by the Santa Cruz County Flood Control District. There is no cost for these permits. This is free of charge. In the town of Patagonia, the town does its own permitting. Permits also protect property owners from being held responsible for damages by the federal government in the event of a federally declared disaster for a flood event. It's not that you can't build in the floodplain, it's that you have to build differently. With that, thank you for your attention on this, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, John Hayes. My phone number is 520-375-7830, or by email at jhayes@santacruzcountyaz.gov. Thank you.